What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Wrestling Decoded. And today we're doing something that sounds simple until you actually try to do it honestly. Picking the WrestleMania moments that genuinely defined a generation isn't about the biggest pops or the most dramatic entrances. It's about the handful of nights where something happened inside that ring that permanently changed how wrestling worked afterward. Moments that wrestlers, writers, and fans still reference as a before and after line in the industry's history. So let's go through them in order and make the case for why each one actually mattered beyond the night itself. Let's get into it. If you're into these deep dives into wrestling's most defining chapters, that's exactly what this channel does. Go ahead and subscribe before we start. The first moment on this list doesn't come from the most technically impressive match WrestleMania has ever produced, and it doesn't come from the show's biggest ever gate. It comes from WrestleMania 3, March 29, 1987, in the Pontiac Silverdome in Michigan, in front of what was at the time the largest indoor crowd in North American sports history, somewhere between 78,000 and 93,000 people, depending on which official count you accept. And the moment that actually defined a generation from that night wasn't the pyrotechnics or the spectacle, it was a single body slam. Hulk Hogan lifting Andre the Giant off the mat, a man widely believed to be physically impossible to lift, and slamming him to the canvas before dropping the leg drop for the pin. In terms of pure in-ring quality, the match itself was limited, but as a statement about what WrestleMania could be, a genuine nationally televised event capable of putting 93,000 people in the same building over a professional wrestling match. That one body slam established the commercial ceiling of the entire industry in ways that still apply today. Every massive WrestleMania gate, every stadium show WWE has done since, traces back to the proof of concept that night in Pontiac provided. Here's a question worth sitting with. How many of the moments on this list do you think would have happened if WrestleMania 3 hadn't first established that wrestling could fill a stadium and make mainstream news doing it? Moving forward to WrestleMania X 1994, and a moment from a match that fundamentally changed what fans expected from a WrestleMania undercard, Shawn Michaels versus Razor Ramon, a ladder match for the Intercontinental Championship, wasn't the main event of that show. That spot went to Bret Hart and Lex Luger in separate title matches. But Michaels and Ramon's match has since been identified by nearly every major wrestling historian as the moment that established the ladder match as a viable WrestleMania format, an attraction capable of stealing an entire show from performers positioned above it on the card. More importantly, it shifted the conversation about what mid-card wrestlers could accomplish at WrestleMania, proving that the show's legacy-defining moments didn't exclusively belong to whoever was headlining. Every TLC match, every Money in the Bank ladder match, and arguably the entire concept of the WWE mid-card earning its own WrestleMania spotlight traces back to what Michaels and Ramon built together on that night in Madison Square Garden. Then WrestleMania 30, 1997, and the single most important double turn in wrestling history, the match that demonstrates most clearly how genuinely great storytelling can make an audience do something it didn't plan to do when it walked into the building. Bret Hart walked into that match as a face, Steve Austin walked in as a heel, and by the time it was over, the crowd had completely reversed its own position on both men without anyone explicitly telling them to. Hart, refusing to break the sharpshooter even as Austin bled profusely across the mat and eventually passed out rather than tap, drew heat from the audience despite doing exactly what a hero is supposed to do, refusing to quit, winning decisively, standing victorious. Austin, refusing to surrender despite being in genuine agony, earned respect from that same audience despite being the one written as the villain. The submission on the sharpshooter, with Austin bleeding through his forehead and Ken Shamrock calling the stoppage, generated one of the most organic crowd responses WrestleMania had produced to that point. No explicit announcement, no story beat telegraphing the turn, just two performers executing a match so well that the audience arrived at the conclusion on its own. Quick pause here. Drop a comment on which of these moments you think is most underrated in WrestleMania's overall history, because I genuinely believe the Hart-Austin double turn at WrestleMania 13 gets about half the credit it actually deserves in most conversations about the show's legacy. WrestleMania 13, 2003 brings us to a moment that defined a generation in a different way than the others, not through a great match or a clean finish, but through an ending that became one of the most studied examples in wrestling of how to protect two performers simultaneously in defeat. Brock Lesnar attempted a shooting star press off the top rope late in his match against Kurt Angle and landed badly, suffering a legitimate concussion on impact. He got up and finished the match anyway, hitting an F5 on Angle to retain the WWE Championship, and most fans watching live had no idea anything had gone wrong at all. That moment sits in WrestleMania history as a reminder of how much genuine physical risk these performers absorb, often invisible to the audience watching, and it's been cited by multiple wrestlers since as one of the defining examples of the difference between performing through pain and performing beyond safe limits. WrestleMania Decoded 2014 is where this list lands its most emotionally complete entry and the one most clearly defined by real fan investment rather than purely by in-ring craft. Daniel Bryan's path to winning the WWE World Heavyweight Championship that night has been covered extensively across wrestling media, but the specific element worth focusing on here is what his victory actually proved about the relationship between WWE's creative direction and the audience watching it. Bryan was not originally planned for the WrestleMania main event. The Yes movement, built over months of genuine fan investment in Bryan being repeatedly denied his opportunity, forced a complete restructuring of the show's headline match. What Bryan winning at WrestleMania Decoded actually demonstrated more than any other moment in recent WWE history was that a sustained, organic fan movement could overwrite creative plans at the company's highest level, at its most important annual event, and produce something more emotionally resonant than whatever the original plan would have been. Every conversation since about WWE listening to fan pressure traces back to the proof that it worked at WrestleMania 30. And then WrestleMania 29 2013, which earns its place on this list, not because of the match quality, but because of what the main event's outcome reveals about how WWE makes its long-term decisions. John Cena defeating The Rock in their WrestleMania 29 rematch in what felt to many fans like the wrong outcome given the previous year's result, was almost universally received with disappointment in real time. Revisited now, it's a genuinely interesting creative choice. WWE kept its top active full-time performer strong, heading into the next phase of programming rather than building the part-time star up further at the full-time roster's expense. Whether that was the right call remains debated. But the fact that it's still being debated a decade later says something about how much that specific decision shaped the conversation around part-time stars being prioritized over full-time roster members, a discussion that never fully left WWE programming in the years since. And finally, WrestleMania 38 Night 1, April 2022, a moment that belongs on this list because of what it represented rather than what it produced. Cody Rhodes returning to WWE in front of a full stadium crowd, competing in the same company he'd left 6 years earlier over creative frustration, built to a full pyrotechnic entrance, and a reaction that confirmed the return had real audience value before a single move was thrown. That night didn't just reintroduce a performer. It began a narrative arc that ran through 2 consecutive WrestleManias and produced one of the most sustained, long-form redemption stories WWE has told in the modern era. It belongs on this list because it's proof that WrestleMania's greatest moments aren't always about the match itself. Sometimes they're about what the match is actually announcing to the audience about where the story is heading next. So here's the actual thread connecting all of these moments across nearly 4 decades of WrestleMania. None of them were the biggest match on their respective card, evaluated purely on technical criteria. WrestleMania 3's Body Slam was 3 minutes of limited in-ring work. The Hart-Austin double turn happened in the middle of a show most fans remember primarily for its Undertaker match. Daniel Bryan's win required the entire creative plan to be rebuilt around fan pressure. What they share is that each one permanently changed something about what WrestleMania could be, about what fans expected from it, about how WWE understood its own relationship with the audience watching. That's what genuinely defines a generation, not the match rating. The before and after line. Which WrestleMania moment do you think belongs on this list that we didn't cover today? Let me know down in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into wrestling's most defining chapters, make sure you're subscribed to Wrestling Decoded. There's plenty more of this still to uncover.